Hello, my name is Hossein Nakhaei, and today I will discuss how 3D modeling can serve as an analytical tool to help us better understand the spatial configuration of the Emamzadeh Yahya complex in Varamin. When we think of 3D modeling in architectural history, we often imagine detailed digital simulations or precise 3D scans of architectural elements or entire buildings. But that's only part of the story. 3D modeling is not just a technical process, but a way of thinking spatially. At its core, 3D modeling is a way of translating two-dimensional information, such as plans, sections, photographs, into a three-dimensional spatial understanding. This shift allows us to see spatial relationships and pose new questions that may not emerge from 2D representations alone. A model doesn't have to be complex to do this. Once we think of 3D modeling as a tool for analysis rather than just representation, visual complexity becomes less important. The focus instead shifts to answering specific spatial questions. This presentation explores how even a simple model can serve this function in the study of a historical building. The case I examine is the 13th to early 14th century Emamzadeh Yahya complex in Varamin, which includes the tomb of Yahya ibn Ali, a ninth-century Shia saint. Today, the tomb stands as a single domed chamber surrounded by smaller rooms. However, until the late 19th century, it was part of a much larger architectural complex. Our clearest view of this complex in its likely Ilkhanid period configuration is this 1881 photograph taken by the French explorer Jean Dieulafoy. The tomb of Emamzadeh Yahya appears at the back, marked by its distinctive step dome. Other structures visible in the photograph were demolished lightly in the early 20th century. While substantial research has focused on the decoration of the tomb, its broader spatial layout remains insufficiently studied. The only attempt prior to my recent work is a plan proposed by the American art historian Donald Newton Wilber in 1955, based primarily on visual and textual records published by Dieulafoy. Although Wilber's plan has been frequently reproduced and referenced, its accuracy has not been critically assessed. In this presentation, I will evaluate Wilber's proposed plan by creating a simple 3D model of the complex, drawing on Dieulafoy's 1881 photograph, as well as a second image taken by the German art historian Friedrich Zare in 1897. Because the site is now located within an active cemetery and an excavation in the areas of the demolished structures is almost impossible to undertake, this method offers a valuable alternative approach to understanding the original layout of the complex. First, let me briefly outline the site as it exists today. The tomb sits in the middle of a cemetery in the Kohnegel neighborhood in Varamin. The site has two entrances, a main entrance on the north and a secondary entrance at the rear, which is mostly used by local residents of the neighborhood. The tomb now consists of a single domed chamber at the center. Two nearly identical eyvans project from the north and south sides of the structure, and 10 rooms with low domes surround it. These structures are considered later additions to the dome chamber and were likely constructed during the site's major alterations in the early 20th century. This photograph, taken in 1934, is one of our earliest views of the tomb in its new configuration. Note the new walls of the courtyard on the far right and portions of likely old walls on the back left. Today, there are no physical traces of the demolished structures, and to understand what once stood here, we must turn to textual and visual sources from the late 19th century. One of the most important pieces of evidence to understand the site's earlier configuration is Dieulafoy's 1881 photograph. It clearly shows three main elements: the dome chamber, a monumental entrance portal on its left, and an octagonal tower capped with a pyramidal roof on its right. These structures are connected by a series of deteriorated walls and separated from their immediate surroundings by a partially ruined enclosure wall made of brick and mud. A woodcut version of this photograph, along with Dieulafoy's discussion on the complex, first published in 1883 in Le Tour du Monde and later included in her Travelet La Perse in 1887. In her published notes, Dieulafoy uses the term mosque, most likely referring to the dome chamber or the entire site. At the time, the term was often used interchangeably with Emamzadeh, likely because such buildings frequently contained mihrabs. As we will see, this terminological ambiguity later entered scholarly interpretations of the site's layout. Although it is not visible in the photograph, Dieulafoy describes the octagonal tower as decorated with brickwork and compares it to the 12th century tomb of Yusuf ibn Qusayl in Nakhjavan. Beyond their similar forms, the tower in Varamin appears to have had an inscription band just below the dome, much like the example in Nakhjavan. In the case of the entrance portal, brickwork is visible on both sides. Although the wall had already collapsed, remnants of muqarnas can still be seen in its left corner. A band running beneath them, which likely reserved for an inscription, is also visible. The photograph also shows that the area in front of the shrine was filled with graves marked by bricks. Among these scattered graves stands a rectangular structure elevated above ground level, which is possibly an abambar, an underground cistern traditionally used to supply drinking water to the public. The presence of an abambar near major landmarks was common in historic urban settings. Comparable examples existed in front of the Congregational Mosque and near Emamzadeh Sakineh Banu, both in Varamin. Dieulafoy's visual and textual records of the site have long served as the principal points of reference in discussions of the shrine. However, her original photograph was not widely known until it was digitized in 2021. Instead, the aforementioned woodcut version, published in 1883 and later 1887, circulated widely and became more accessible to scholars. Although the woodcut closely follows the original photograph, it introduces subtle modifications, most notably the additions of human figures to the scene. Such additions may have influenced perceptions of scale. This point is significant because, as we will see, the woodcut became a primary reference for an attempt to reconstruct the layout of the complex. The second photograph, taken by Zare 16 years after Dieulafoy's, shows that the three principal components of the complex were still standing in 1897. From this angle, the massive entrance portal partially masked the octagonal tower, but a portion of its roof marked by the red arrow, remains visible. Zare published this photograph in 1910 in his seminal book, Monuments of Persian Architecture, in German, alongside a brief description of the Emamzadeh. As we learn from his text, he was not permitted to enter the site, and his observations appear to have been made from outside. This photograph is currently the last known visual record of the complex before its major architectural transformation in the early 20th century. Compared to Dieulafoy's digitized photograph, the published reproduction of Zare reveals far fewer details. The original glass plate of his photograph has not yet been located, but if found, it could offer much greater visual insight into what he witnessed. As already mentioned, in 1955, Donald Wilber was the first to propose a plan for the shrine's original layout, based on Dieulafoy's 1880s woodcut. By the time he visited the site in 1939, several of the structures visible in the 19th century photographs had already been demolished. What he encountered instead were a series of small rooms with low domes surrounding the central chamber, which he believed were later additions. In his proposed plan, Wilber arranged the three principal elements: the portal, the dome chamber, and the octagonal tower in an elongated layout. He placed the portal at a distance of nearly 40 meters from the dome chamber, with the octagonal tower sitting roughly in the middle. The entrance was lined along the central axis of the dome chamber, and a series of rooms connected these buildings. Wilber identified these intermediary rooms as the mosque mentioned in Dieulafoy's account, whereas, as we have seen, the term in her text most likely refers to the dome chamber or even the entire site. To evaluate Wilber's plan, I created a basic three-dimensional model using SketchUp to determine whether his proposed configuration aligns with the visual evidence. The dome chamber was modeled according to its current measurements, while the octagonal tower and entrance portal were reconstructed hypothetically based on his layout. After adjusting the model's viewpoint to match the perspective of Dieulafoy's photograph, using the dome chamber as the fixed reference point, a clear discrepancy emerged. In Wilber's plan, the portal and octagonal tower are positioned at a considerable distance from the central chamber. In the woodcut, however, both appear significantly closer. This suggests that Wilber's proposal overestimates the scale of the complex. To reassess the site's original configuration, we need a three-dimensional understanding of the complex. But because all of its major components, except the dome chamber, no longer survive, conducting photogrammetric surveys or other forms of spatial documentation is not possible. One possible approach is to use recent AI-based tools that generate 3D models directly from 2D images. For this purpose, I experimented with a tool called Meshi, which is an AI platform designed to transform photographs into three-dimensional models. However, the tool reconstructs each image independently and cannot produce a model that aligns consistently with both historical photographs. As you can see, the generated result appears convincing when viewed from roughly the same angle as the original photograph. Of course, we have to ignore the additional details added by the AI. But once the perspective changes, the reconstruction no longer corresponds to the second photograph. More advanced multi-view reconstruction methods, such as NERF, are designed to address this issue by enforcing consistency across different viewpoints. Yet, these approaches typically require a large number of overlapping images and reliable camera calibration that are not available in the case of the Emamzadeh Yahya complex. To address these limitations, I instead developed a 3D model grounded in the combined evidence of Dieulafoy's and Zare's photographs. These two views, taken from nearly perpendicular angles, are particularly valuable because they allow the model to be tested from different perspectives. In fact, each photograph serves as a check on the other. I began by constructing a new basic model composed of the three principal elements: the dome chamber, the entrance portal, and the octagonal tower, and then refined it through an iterative process. Distances, alignments, and proportions were adjusted step by step, with each change tested against both views. Even small modifications that improved alignment in one view could create distortions in the other. Through this back and forth process, a configuration gradually emerged that is consistent with both photographs. The result reveals several important revisions to Wilber's proposal. Compared to his plan, the new layout is much more compact. Instead of nearly 40 meters between the dome chamber and the entrance portal, the distance was likely closer to 27 meters. The octagonal tower, likewise, stood much nearer to the dome chamber than Wilber proposed, probably at its northeastern corner. When this revised layout is overlaid onto the aerial photograph of the complex, further implications emerged. The present northern enclosing wall appears to stand roughly on the line of the original wall. The entrance portal, however, was not aligned with the center of the dome chamber. Moreover, the tower's likely position corresponds to an area now occupied by small rooms, adding further support to the prevailing consensus that these structures were later additions. So far, the model has helped us reassess the overall layout of the complex, but it also helps us to reconsider specific architectural elements. Let me turn to one example, the eyvan in front of the dome chamber. In Wilber's plan, the space between the entrance portal and the dome chamber is depicted as a long corridor. However, a closer look at Dieulafoy's photograph suggests something different. Rather than a single uninterrupted corridor, we see an opening of an eyvan in front of the dome chamber. This opening is visible as a dark zone partially obscured by the portal. If we compare the model's layout with the current plan of the building, we see that the original eyvan was likely in the same spot as the current one, but nearly twice its current depth. During the restoration of the site in the 1980s, plaster decoration with stucco plugs similar to those covering the interior of the chamber was uncovered on the exterior wall of the dome chamber where the eyvan is attached. The presence of this Ilkhanid style decoration in the area covered by the eyvan supports the idea that the eyvan was part of the original Ilkhanid layout rather than a later addition. At this time, we do not have sufficient evidence to determine whether the eyvan originally stood as a single structure or whether additional structures were attached to its sides. In Zare's view, the eyvan appears to be blocked by a structure, which is possibly a small tomb, on the left side of the entrance. Some evidence of a wall is visible behind this structure, which may be a remnant of the eyvan's wall. However, confirming these details would require access to the higher quality version of the photograph. Returning to Dieulafoy's photograph, we can identify a space between the opening of the eyvan and the entrance portal. This area has functioned as a courtyard connecting the portal, the tower, and the dome chamber. Additional support for this interpretation comes from the 1934 photograph, which shows a fountain in front of the tomb. Although it remains uncertain whether this fountain belonged to the original configuration or was added at a later stage, its presence suggests the possibilities of an open space in this area before major modifications in the early 20th century. In a photograph from 1978, the fountain appears to have been modified with higher walls added around it. Today, the fountain is buried and no longer visible. Identifying the eyvan also raises new questions about other architectural elements visible in Dieulafoy's photograph. Several ruined walls appear to connect the octagonal tower and the entrance portal. Dieulafoy herself mentions the distinctive way in which old and new masonry were joined together, which may refer to these now lost elements. Although their precise configuration cannot yet be reconstructed, simple modeling might provide a framework to investigate these structures in future research. In addition, there appears to be other spaces within the complex that are difficult to identify with the evidence currently available. One example is the area when a group of men is shown seated in a separate photograph. This photograph is mounted alongside the general view of the site, and based on Dieulafoy's description of men guarding the complex before her entry, it was likely taken at the Emamzadeh Yahya complex. However, this space does not correspond to any parts known to us with the available imagery and may instead relate to a section not visible in the photograph. Notably, the plaster surfaces visible in the image are decorated with stucco plugs similar to those covered the interior of the dome chamber and its eyvan, suggesting that these walls may date to the Ilkhanid period. In conclusion, this case study shows how even a relatively simple 3D model based on historical photographs can deepen our understanding of the spatial organization of a lost or altered architectural complex. Rather than functioning merely as visual reconstructions, such models operate as an analytical tool that make it possible to test spatial relationships, identify inconsistencies, and generate new questions from fragmentary evidence. In this process, historical photographs become more than documentary images. They function as repositories of spatial information that can be critically re-examined through digital modeling. In the case of the Emamzadeh Yahya, where archaeological investigation is not feasible and the architectural remains are fragmentary, this approach, through its maximum use of existing sources, such as historical photographs, offers a productive means of reimagining lost spatial configurations and opens new avenues for research by allowing us to engage more critically and creatively with the limited evidence that survives. Thank you.